Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to this induction session that focuses on behaviour for learning. My name is Dan Roberts and I'm an assistant principal at GEMS Winchester School Dubai, and I've put together this session which I do hope you will find informative and useful ahead of you joining your new school this year. As you can see, the length of this session is somewhere between 30 minutes and 45 minutes, depending upon how long it takes you to take part in some of the activities I've designed throughout the session. Now, the aim for these sessions is that by the end of this session, I hope you will have a very clear definition of the term behaviour for learning. Each of us has probably come across that term at some stage in our career, but I want you to leave this session having that very clear idea of what behaviour for learning is. The second thing I hope that you'll take from this session is being able to describe some of the key aspects of high quality student behaviour. And thirdly, I hope you'll be able to explain some different techniques that can be used to achieve behaviour for learning in your classroom and reflect upon what you might be able to do in your own classroom, depending upon what you take from this session. So without further ado, let's have a quick starter, and we're going to start straight away with that term behaviour for learning. What I'd like you to do is just have a think about what that term behaviour for learning means to you. So just pause this video and spend a few moments coming up with a definition. When you're happy with your definition, hit play. So hopefully by now you've got a definition of what behaviour for learning means to you. Here's what behaviour for learning means for me. Behaviour for learning is more than just students doing as they're told and behaving really well in your class. Of course, that's fundamental. That's a really important part of being a great teacher, is making sure the students do what you ask them to do. But for me, behaviour for learning encompasses more than that, and it's about ensuring that those students engage in the lesson, that they listen really well, they speak really clearly, they participate in what you're doing. And for me, there's a difference between those two things. Behaviour is just, do students do what they're told? But you can have good behaviour with passive students. I want, and I know that the rest of the schools across this cluster, we want behaviour for learning in lessons. We want students who are active, engaged participants in your lessons. So if we know then that that's what behaviour for learning is and what we're looking for, we then really need to unpack what we mean by high quality behaviour for learning. So again, what I'd just like you to do is pause the video and think, when you've gone into a classroom, and I'm sure this has happened for all of you in your career, and if you're new to teaching, think back to when you were at school. But think about those great lessons that had high quality behaviour for learning. What did those lessons look like? What were students doing? What did it sound like in those classrooms? And what did it feel like? Now again, as I've said, just pause that video, and when you're ready, hit play to hear what I think about these. So for me, the high quality behaviour for learning looks like many different things. Sometimes high quality behaviour for learning is students with their heads down writing really hard, but every student in the classroom you can see is engaged and engrossed in what they're doing. Sometimes those lessons look noisy and they're messy, if you like, and those are where students are maybe interacting with each other in group works. Now that leads to what the lessons sound like. Some people think high quality behaviour for learning requires a quiet classroom, and you know what? Sometimes it possibly does. But also high quality behaviour for learning lessons sometimes are noisy. You've got students engaged in debating and arguing with each other in a nice, positive, constructive way, of course. But those lessons are sometimes noisy, and that's a great thing. I always say, I do a lot of learning walks as a senior leader, and I've carried out a lot over the course of my career. And the best lessons that I go into for behaviour for learning are often the ones that I can walk into and nobody notices I'm there. Either because they're so engrossed in what they're doing as an individual task, or because they're working really collaboratively in a group, or because they're having a debate, and they don't even notice that I walk into the room. That's for me, the real sign of fantastic high quality behaviour for learning. And on to that final thing of what does it feel like? This is hard for me to quantify, but you can sometimes feel an energy in a classroom. Sometimes you walk into a classroom and you can feel that there's little energy at all, and it's quite low, and students are passive and they're slumped in the seats. You can look, when you go into a high quality behaviour for learning lesson, you can see that students are sat up, you can see they're attentive, but you can feel an energy of learning in the room. And that's what we're aiming for. Now, a lot of people have said to me that's really hard to achieve, and of course it does take a lot of work, but I do firmly believe that any teacher can achieve those things with the right pointers, the right practice, and the right reflection more than anything else. Now, one of the things I think is key to a really high quality behaviour for learning is positive relationships. And of course, there are multiple reasons why teachers should seek to establish positive relationships with their students. Again, just pause that video and try and come up with some reasons. Why do you think it's important to develop positive relationships with your students? When you're ready, hit play. So hopefully by now you've come up with a list of reasons why you think it's important for teachers to establish those positive relationships. For me, this is the number one reason. Learning happens best when relationships support the needs and the rights of everyone in a classroom to feel safe, respected and valued. It's what we would describe as a sense of belonging. And that for me is so important. Okay, I think back to my own education, and I know that the ones where I had a strong relationship with the teacher are the ones where I wanted to work hard and show that teacher how great I could be. Where I maybe found it difficult to build those relationships with some teachers, I didn't necessarily enjoy that subject quite as much. And I'm sure a lot of you can sympathise with that point of view. Now, of course, each school that you go into will have its own system of rewards that you can use, as well as a system of sanctions or consequences. But from my experience, students always respond best to positive praise. So in every school you have, it will be really important, no matter which school you're joining, that you learn the behaviour management policy of that school. There'll be two sides to it. There will be that positive side. There will then also be a sanctions or consequence side as well. For me, if I'm having to use the consequences side, it means I probably haven't either planned a lesson as well as I'd hoped I had, or I haven't been able to develop a positive relationship or use the positive side of the behaviour management tools I have as well as I might have liked to. Now, it is really important that you learn your behaviour management guide for your new school and you stick to it, and this is something we're going to go back over a few times in this session. Now, one way of developing a positive relationship with a class is what I would describe as positive framing. Okay, so this is a great technique for maintaining high expectations through positive reinforcement rather than moaning or being aggressive or angry or annoyed, frustrated with a class instead. And there are a series of things now that I'd just like to talk through with you with how I think positive framing makes a massive difference to building good relationships with students. Now, the first part of positive framing is about establishing your expectations. Now, if you've not made your expectations clear, it's really hard to reaffirm your standards with a class. So I do start every year or every new class that I take over with a few moments where I lay out my expectations. They match, they're aligned, of course, with my school policy on behaviour management, but I talk to them about what I expect. Okay, now that can be, in some ways, a little bit boring and repetitive for students, but I do think it's so important that you are clear with what you want from them. If you're not clear, how do you reinforce what you want from a class? Now, the first thing I always do if I've got a student who's maybe disrupting or not getting things right is I try to affirm things positive responses first. Okay, so imagine a scenario. I've got a class of 30 students. They're in 5 groups of 6, okay, and they're working on a collaborative task. I then stand at the front and I want to end the lesson maybe, and I say to them, everybody, please be quiet, pack up and get ready to go. I notice that some of the students don't hear me, maybe because actually they're so engrossed in what they're doing, but sometimes it's just because they're noisy and they couldn't hear me. Now, I could then shout and get angry and frustrated with them. But what I actually like to do is I like to be positive first. So I go, fantastic, well done to this table. Thank you for being ready. Thank you for listening and you're ready to learn. Or sometimes when I'm finishing a lesson and I want everyone to pack up quickly, and I'll say to the class, right, everybody, I'd like you to pack up quickly and quietly. I notice that some students haven't. Rather than being aggressive and confrontational with those students, I would say to the class, thank you to everyone who's packed away so quickly and quietly. We've still got a couple of people to go, but thank you to everybody who's got it right. I tend to find that's a much more positive way of achieving the same goal, which is getting everyone packed away as quickly and quietly as possible. We can also frame correction as positive reinforcement, okay? Now, you could, if you've got a student, and in this scenario I've used Ahmed, Ahmed is turning around, he's talking, he's really frustrating you. You could say, Ahmed, stop talking and turn around. It's quite confrontational, it's quite aggressive. And for me, it's really unnecessary because you could just say, Ahmed, I really would like you to turn around, look at me and listen. Thank you. Now notice I used the word thanks or thank you instead of please. Please would suggest to the student that they have some form of choice in the matter. They have no choice. I want them to do it. If you say thank you, it assumes they're going to do what you've asked them to. If you say please, it makes it feel like there's a choice. So you always want to try and end a sentence, I think, with the word thank you or thanks. So Ahmed, I'd like to turn around, look this way and listen to me. Thank you. It assumes they're going to do what you want. Another good technique for positive framing is giving students the benefit of the doubt. So there are times where you'll say to a student, and you might slip into bad habits, and you say, Mohammed, please stop talking, turn around and listen to me, thank you. And they say to you, sir, I wasn't talking. Well, you've got two responses there. One, you can turn around and be aggressive and confrontational and say, why are you talking back to me? I think that creates, again, a difficult relationship with that student. Instead, try this kind of sentence. Well, maybe you're right, Mohammed, but I now need you to focus on the activities. Thank you. Give them a bit of benefit of a doubt. You ultimately want that student to be quiet and listening and ready to learn, so don't get caught up in an argument when you can use a different way of framing what you want from a student, and it's much more effective from my experience. This is also a lovely technique, which is assuming confusion over defiance. So when a student doesn't do necessarily what you want them to, you could go down the route of why are you not doing what I want you to do? But you can always go, oh, do you know what? I wonder if everybody's heard my instructions because it's still really noisy in here. Or maybe there's some confusion here. Maybe I didn't explain this well enough. Let's just go through everything again and let me explain to everyone what I want you to do so you can understand my expectations. Place the emphasis here on you being a bit of an idiot and maybe you getting things wrong. Now, of course, that's probably not true, but from a student perspective, it allows them to back down and it is more likely to lead to them doing what you want them to do. Now, positive framing and building positive relationships is really important, but I also think advanced planning is. So here are a list of things that I think you can do in advance of a lesson to help that lesson run really smoothly. There's a whole range of things on here, but what I'd like you to do again is pause that video and have a look at the things that are written here and just reflect. Do you currently do any of these things? If you do, great. If you don't, which ones of these things do you think might be easy to do? When you're ready to move on, hit play again. So I think there's a load of great, fantastic things there. Some of the things that I personally love using is having spare pens and rulers and equipment for students. I know it shouldn't be our responsibility to give them, but if you know you have a student who always forgets a pen, I think it's much easier to give them a pen and contact their parents and say, your child keeps turning up to my lesson without a pen, because sometimes it isn't the child's fault. If the parents can't afford to buy a pen and a pencil for that student, then it's not the kid's fault that they're not turning up with the right equipment. So instead, give it to them, lend it to them, but make contact with a parent and have that conversation with them rather than with the student. I also think it's always great to think about your lesson from a pupil perspective. So I often go into my lessons and into my classroom and I sit at the back and I imagine, what would it be like to try and look at this board? Is what I've put up on the screen easy for them to get involved in, or is it too difficult because they're too far away? Think about what your lesson will be like from a pupil perspective. And lastly, as I've already mentioned, please make sure you read the school's behaviour policy, know it inside and out, and use it. Okay? If we don't use it properly, then we'll end up with problems in all of our schools. You must make sure you consistently use the policy. Now, what I'd just like you to do in a moment is think about how you might manage difficult behaviour. So I'm sure you've all had moments, and I've had moments, where we do have students, despite our best efforts, who are difficult. Of course, every situation we deal with will be different there, but I do think there are some strategies for managing difficult behaviour that are more effective than others. So what I'd like you to do is pause the video and I'd like you to read the article, 10 Easy Behaviour Management Tips for Lesson Success. When you're ready, hit play again. I do hope you found that article interesting, and I do hope that you managed to take something away from it. Now, from my experience, the best form of professional development is where you do reflections once you've read something. So, having had that opportunity to read that article, I would like you to reflect on 3 questions. The first is, which of those top 10 tips that you've just read about do you already use? Which ones do you maybe not use that you could add to your toolkit easily for dealing with student behaviour in your classroom? The second activity I'd like you to do, or the second reflection, is do you agree with the list? Do you think it has everything that should be included, or do you think it's missing things? If it's missing things, what would you include in that top 10 list from your own experience? And thirdly, what do you think is the most important takeaway from that article that you would want every single teacher around the world and across the GEMS network to use in their classroom? Which is most important and why? When you've carried out those reflections, please hit play to move on to the next part of this training session. So having carried out your reflections on that article, I'd like to run through some different scenarios with you to get you thinking about how would you deal with them. So the first scenario is, I want you to imagine that the bell has just rung to start a new lesson and you've invited the students into your classroom. You're ready to start your lesson, but you notice that students are still standing around, they're not really listening, they're having difficulty, and you're having difficulties getting them sat down ready to learn. What would you do about it? The second scenario is, I want you to think about your school having a bring your own device policy, a BYOD policy. Now, as you're circulating around the room during the lesson to check on how students are doing, you notice that some students are using their device for listening to music, playing games, being on social media, rather than completing the activities that you want them to do. How would you deal with that? And the third scenario is, I want you to imagine you're teaching a blended class. So that's happened obviously a lot over the last 18 months or so, where you have some of your students in the classroom learning and some of those students connecting into your classroom from home using the internet and software like Microsoft Teams and Zoom and so on. You notice that one of the students at home is repeatedly turning up late to the lesson, but is also not submitting any work. How would you deal with that? Pause the video again, have a think about your answers to each of those scenarios, and when you're ready, hit play to hear how I would deal with them. So of course, there are a range of different ways of dealing with these scenarios, and just because I'm saying them doesn't necessarily mean it'll be right for you and right for every situation. But I just thought I'd share with you how I would deal with each of these scenarios. So that first one, where I've got students who've come into the classroom, but they're not, despite me saying, please everyone can you sit down, they're not listening, how would I deal with that? Well, there are 2 different ways. I could get angry and shouty and I could tell them all off and make them sit down and be aggressive. You know, though, from earlier on in this training session, that isn't really my style. So again, I would stand at the front and I would feign a bit of idiocy on my behalf. And I'd say, God, is it just me? Or has everybody forgotten how we come into a classroom here? Oh, I thought we came in by asking everybody to stand behind their chairs quietly. And then I would say good morning. And then you'd say good morning to me. And then you'd sit down. It's a bit daft, it's a bit stupid, but I'm blaming myself more than I'm blaming the class. And what you'll probably find is that students smile back at you and they'll respond by doing what you ask. Sometimes I might ask the class to go and stand back outside and say to them, oh, clearly you've all forgotten how we come into this room. Everyone get back outside and let's try that again. Thanks. Again, I'm making sure I don't use the words please, I'm using thank you, I'm framing things as positively as I can do. I'm saying it with a bit of a smile on my face as well, because the students I know will respond better to that than if I put angry teacher face on. So you have to think about those things. The second scenario there about bring your own device policy, this has been something that I know a number of teachers have dealt with over the last 18 months since we've been teaching in this kind of more blended way of teaching and learning. And there are different ways of dealing with this. For me, I would want to go and talk to those students one-on-one as quietly as possible. What I wouldn't want to do is draw big attention to it across the classroom, because I think in that scenario, if I drew attention to the fact that these kids were playing games and they shouldn't be, there's an opportunity for that student to kick back at me and say, no, I'm not, and we have a big argument in front of the class and I lose control. I wouldn't want that. So instead, I'd probably go and sit down next to that student and I'd crouch next to them and I'd say, I'm sorry, Mohammed, but you're playing games and you know you shouldn't be. I'm going to give you a behaviour point for that because you know you shouldn't be doing that and you should be learning instead. What I'd like you to do now is close down those games and get on with the activity. I just want to check though, you know what the activity is. So please tell me what the activity is. Now, by approaching it that way, I think I've done a number of things. One, I've avoided that confrontation in front of the whole class, which means the student's more likely to do what I want. I've also, though, chosen to give that student a behaviour point, which in our school system is our sanctions when students do things we don't want them to do. But I've given that to them by being really clear about why they're getting the behaviour point, and I think that's important. Students need that clarity. But by doing it one-on-one, I've also done it firmly but fair. Okay? If I had done that in front of the class, it might have got into an argument and that would have been really difficult for me to manage. But instead, getting and sitting next to that student will make a different impression on them. But what I finished it by doing was saying, right, tell me what you need to do. Because it may be they're playing games because they didn't understand the instructions I gave them. So I think I did a number of things there all at once, and that's the way I would approach that. But I totally accept there are different ways of doing it. The third thing is something, again, as we've said before, teachers have been struggling with over the last few months, and that's how do you interact with students who are maybe not joining your blended classrooms. In this scenario, I actually find the best way of approaching it is talking to the families. So I do phone calls home and I do emails home, but I frame that conversation in a certain way. So I could be really confrontational with the family and say, your child isn't submitting any work, they're turning up late to lessons, it's really not good enough, please sort it out. I tend to find that parents don't respond very well to that. But instead, I could say, I'm phoning you today just because I wanted to point out that your child hasn't been engaging in my lessons as well as they can, and I was wondering if there's anything I can do to help support that. So you're still being clear with why you're phoning and still saying it's because the child isn't engaging, but you're putting the onus onto you. What is it that I can do to help you and your child succeed at school? And from my experience, that works really, really well. Because most of the time, actually, families say, oh, well, there's not much more you can do. I just need to make sure the child does the work. And that's exactly what you want, because that's ultimately your end game, isn't it? You want that student learning as quickly as you can. So that brings us to the end of the session. I do hope it's been a useful one, and I do hope that you've been able to achieve both session aims. So I hope you can define the term behaviour for learning. I hope you're now able to describe those key aspects of high quality student behaviour. And I hope you've had a chance to think about some different techniques and think about how you might use them in your own teaching to enhance what you do around behaviour for learning even further. So what I'd like you to do is finish with a short plenary. So please, in a moment, pause the video and just reflect on these questions. So the first one is, what do you already know in terms of your experiences for behaviour for learning from schools you've worked in before? How do you think that's going to help you in your new school? The second is, I want you to think about whether your view on behaviour for learning has changed as a result of this session. If it has, why? If it hasn't, why not? And thirdly, what do you think has been the most important thing that you've gone through in this session, either through something I've said or a reflection you've had that you will use in your new school? Okay, what's the most important thing and how will you use it in your new school? When you've had a chance to do those reflections, just hit play again, because I'm just going to leave you with one final slide before I finish the session. So hopefully now you've had a chance to reflect on this session through the plenary activity. I just want to leave you with some takeaways from my point of view. 3 things that I think are really important you take away from this session. The first is, take the time to learn your school's system for managing student behaviour. Every school has something similar, but they are slightly different. And remember that using the positive element of that system will be way more effective and is way more important than using the negative sanctions and consequences system. The second thing is, make an effort to get to know your students. And we've talked about this in terms of building positive relationships with students. Say hello to them around the school when on duty is one of the things I do all the time. So with those students I find more difficult and perhaps more challenging to manage, when I'm on duty, I go and look for those students and I just say to them, hey, how are you doing? Tell me about your football team. How did they do at the weekend? What are you doing this weekend coming up? Anything nice, anything interesting? And I'm trying to build a relationship, because that way I know when I then have to sanction that student, I've put some credit in with them already. I've already built a relationship. So although when I sanction them, a little bit of our relationship might get damaged, I know that there's still something there that I've built up with them over time. And again, that's a really important point for me. If I have to sanction a child, I make sure I go and find them the following day, and I make sure I start building that relationship back up again. And thirdly, if you do have to sanction a student, please do so in a calm manner. I want you to show empathy and patience and care. Remember that scenario where I went and I would talk to the child one on one. Firm and fair is great, but also make sure you give that sanction clearly and make sure you do it in such a way that's unlikely to create you a problem and an argument in front of any other students or any other members of the school community. So that's it from me. Thank you for taking the time to participate in this session. I hope you've enjoyed it, and I wish you all the very best for joining your new school in the near future. Take care, everybody.